True frightening stories about devastating injuries that people survived against all odds. Or r/AskReddit. Doctors and nurses of Reddit. What's your "man, he shouldn't have survived" story? Finally, my time to shine. I am a hematologist. I deal with leukemia and lymphoma, unexplained anemia, that kind of stuff. My favorite story to tell is that one of a patient. Let's call him Mr. X. Well, Mr. X is a 38 years old patient who presented with swollen abdomen, extreme fatigue, peripheral edema, and multiple enlarged lymph nodes. To paint a mental image, imagine a huge purple potato with toothpicks for limbs and inflated gloves for hands. It wasn't looking human at all. After a lymph node biopsy, the diagnosis came. It is Hodgkin lymphoma. Let's call it HL. And just to clarify, let us call it again Hodgkin's lymphoma. That's Hodgkin's lymphoma, HODGKIN''SLYMPHOMA, Hodgkin's lymphoma. Now, Hodgkin's lymphoma is one of the few curable diseases if treated correctly. 6 to 8 rounds of chemotherapy. However, the subtype was rather aggressive and with poor prognosis, so his chances were grim to say the least. One course of chemotherapy is about a month, but seeing his status not improving after 2 weeks, half a round of chemo, of course, he wanted to be discharged and to die in his bed in his home. So, he calls his friend to pick him up and off they go. 1 month later, a healthy-looking man, fit and groomed, approaches me and tells me that he'd like to continue the chemotherapy because he's feeling great. I had no idea who I was talking to until he introduced himself as Mr. X. My jaw dropped to the floor and I sort of rushed to schedule his next rounds of chemo. I asked him what changed his mind about staying, and he tells me that on the way home, after about an hour on the road, he's got a weird appetite, so he asked his friend to pick up a dozen of cans of Spam. You know, the European equivalent at least, and he devoured them on the way home. Seeing that his friend told him when they got home, well, X, if you can cram that shit in your stomach, I'm pretty sure you can take at least 2 more rounds of chemo. So there he was, the living proof that Spam changes lives. So, at the end of the chemotherapy, 8 rounds, he had what we called a complete response, CR. A CR that lasts to these days, 5 years later, and pretty much equivalent to cured, so to speak, in his case. Needless to say, I'm writing cured between quotation marks. No idea why I feel proud about his accomplishment, but it's one of my favorite stories to tell. So yeah, to summarize everything, or TLDR, guy gets cancer, guy gets a little chemo and then rushes home. He eats Spam, gets healthy and resumes his chemo to eventually get cured. And for the people wondering, Spam seems to be some kind of canned meat. So, a lady attended emergency department with her throat slit. She was unfortunately a domestic abuse victim, and a vile man had cut her throat with a very large, sharp, and jagged-edged knife. The wound was so horrific and deep, it still baffles everyone how she survived. But not only did she survive, but she was conscious the entire time. Thanks to the quick actions of the paramedics, they were able to protect the airway and place a tracheostomy. Unfortunately, she has been left with life-changing injuries, unable to eat, and fed via PEG, and left completely unable to talk. We had a guy come into the emergency room because he was feeling kind of dizzy and out of breath. They offered a standard array of labs, and when we, the lab, drew his blood, we noticed that his blood seemed really thin and watery. And that was because he had a fucking 2.7 hemoglobin. Wow. For those of you who know hemoglobin values, I swear on my mother, I'm telling the truth that this man was both walking unconscious when he came in. He even argued about being admitted overnight. We couldn't even get his sample to run at first. We have to fuck with the sensors for it to register. For those of you who don't know hemoglobin values, it's basically measuring how much blood is in your blood, so to speak. And I'm naturally putting those last words in question marks. I mean, quotation marks. And therefore, how much oxygen is capable of being carried throughout your body. Normal hemoglobin is roughly 12 to 16 or so, depending on age and gender. Below 10 is where they start considering the possibility of transfusion, and below 8 is considered critical, and 2.7 should be dead. That person shouldn't be even moving. And since a lot of you people have been asking, the ultimate cause was severe alcoholism. His liver and his pancreas were starting to shut down. So long-term alcoholic anemia coupled with poor diet led to his HGB dropping slowly enough that his body was able to adjust. He survived and was transferred to another facility after transfusing a few units, but probably won't live another 10 years because of the damage already done. So, I'm a first-time poster, so please bear with me if my storytelling isn't the best. To give some context, I'm a wound care director. I'm also a nurse specializing in wounds for 6 years now. I have 2 wound stories about patients that shouldn't have survived in the first place. Patient number 1 was a regular lady, a little overweight, some mild hypertension, nothing crazy. Smart woman, worked a full-time job, aviation mechanic. She comes into my work with NF. That is necrotizing fasciitis. Necrotizing fasciitis. NECROTIZING. FASCIITIS. That is some kind of flesh-eating bacteria. It's very deadly, and it's also some really gnarly shit. She had a 10% chance of survival. Her peritoneum was exposed completely. It had eaten her skin and soft tissues across her abdomen, all the way across top to bottom, around her flanks, the tops of her heights, top of her vagina, under the breasts. And for the people wondering, the peritoneum, it's a serous membrane lining the cavity of the abdomen and covering the abdominal organs. That wound measured about 70 centimeters wide and 120 centimeters long, with a depth of 7 centimeters or so in some parts. And yes, for the Americans watching, that wound was roughly 27.55 inches wide and 47.24 inches long. And about the depth of the wound, it was 2.75 inches deep. So, after many months of wound care, skin grafts, and physical and occupational therapy, she walked right out of the facility, scarred, but completely fine. All of it started from a bug bite, or a cut on her stomach, after swimming in one of the local lakes in our state. As for the patient number 2, it was a patient suffering from severe mental illness. Her and her mother, also with mental illness issues, were living in a motel. One day, patient number 2 gets up and decides that she wasn't going to walk anymore. She sat in the hotel chair for roughly 45 days straight, urinating, defecating, not showering, etc. only in this chair, literally lived and sat in the same spot. Eventually, motel staff received complaints of foul smells. They called the fire department. Her flesh had rotted off, presumed injury that went necrotic, and was eaten away by maggots in that chair. When they lifted her off, her skin had literally liquefied into that chair. For obvious reasons, patient B and her mom became APS cases, and they actually became some of my favorite patients for many years. By the time patient 2 got to me, she had multiple debridement surgeries, and she was left with a permanent colostomy and urostomy. As for the meaning of the abbreviation APS, it stands for antiphospholipid syndrome, sometimes known as Hugh syndrome, which is a disorder of the immune system that causes an increased risk of blood clots. Her wound was 20 to 25 centimeters deep approximately. She was, of course, obese. So imagine large butt cheeks are just gone, down to the bone. I could put my arm halfway up my forearm in her wound and move them side to side. It was easily 60 centimeters wide by 40 centimeters in length. Sacral bone exposed bilaterally, with the bottom, third and fourth vertebrae exposed too. Both butt cheeks were naturally gone. It was just a very deep hole, muscle and bone at this point only. After 1.5 years, her skin grew back, beautifully though. What I found amazing was that the bodies have an ability to grow back separate cheeks. Lol. I know that might sound odd, but from where it was, a massive hole, 2 decent cheeks, the body never ceases to amaze me. I'm a wound care man and I got stories for days.